This is the Registered Behavior Technician course presented by Shaza Attar. The course content was created by Shaza Attar and is the property of Autism Therapy and Training, Inc. All rights are reserved. This training program is based on the Behavior Analyst Certification Board 2018 RBT Task List 2nd edition and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for the RBT credential. The program is offered independent of the BACB. Remember, in each class, we will have our active listening, a quiz, and a competency assessment.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I want you to think of a time that you did something so well, and you were so happy you did it right with such perfection, but then no one acknowledged it. Tough, huh? What happened to your behavior? Did it get better, or did you stop doing that behavior with such perfection? Today's topic is reinforcement. Now, there is no true magic when it comes to why we improve our behavior or why we just stop doing something. There's something known as reinforcement. Reinforcement is the process in which delivering some consequence will result in increasing future occurrences of the behavior. There are two types of reinforcement: positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the addition of a desirable stimulus that increases the future occurrence of a behavior. The key in the definition is addition of a desirable stimulus. This means that something is given following the behavior. For example, you tell your learner to sit down, the child sits down on the floor, and you give a piece of chocolate. Can you only give chocolate and other goodies as an item following a behavior to improve the behavior? No, of course not. We'll discuss different types of reinforcers in just a bit, but it's essential that the individual is given a preferred consequence following that behavior. So to review, a demand of some sort is given, the correct behavior occurs, the preferred consequence is delivered, and over time, we'll see that that behavior begins to happen more and more in the future. So if you were trying to increase a child's cooperation and you were giving the child or the client a reinforcer, but the behavior was not improving, you may question your reinforcer as it may not be effective. How do we increase behaviors using reinforcement? Reinforcers play an important role in the process of reinforcement. The reinforcer is the stimulus that follows the behavior. There are primary reinforcers, also known as unconditioned reinforcers. These are our basic needs such as water, food, warmth, and so on. Then there are secondary reinforcers, also known as conditioned reinforcers, such as toys, games, coloring, and of course not limited to these. Secondary reinforcers was once a neutral stimulus that was paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, did I lose you? If you recall back to our ABA class, I talked about Pavlov and Skinner's conditioning process. Remember? So let's unpack this a little bit more. A neutral stimulus is an item or thing that you have never had an experience with, which means it will not impact your behavior. There's no value to that item. It's neutral. Here is a picture of a gentleman. Let's call him Eddie. He's sitting at a bus stop and you've never seen him before. You probably don't really care. You don't change your behavior in any way. And you stand at the bus stop minding your own business. Eddie is a neutral stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus is an unlearned reinforcer. We don't need to learn the value of food when we're deprived of food. Food automatically functions as a reinforcer. This would be the same as when we're cold. Warmth functions as a reinforcer. Now, behaviors that we engage in to keep warm may be learned, such as rubbing your hands or arms to generate heat. So someone once asked me, what is coffee? Is it an unconditioned stimulus? My answer would be no. Why? When a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, it changes the properties of that neutral stimulus, turning it into a conditioned stimulus. Therefore, coffee is most likely a conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus is a learned behavior. You probably went out with a friend who you really liked, sat down and had your first cup of coffee with them. Maybe you didn't like the taste initially, but over time you got used to it. Or maybe you were a teenager and your friends were drinking it and you were still drinking hot chocolate, but that didn't seem so cool or mature, so coffee seemed like a better option. So that neutral stimulus, coffee, was paired with your friends, turning it into a conditioned stimulus. Let's go back to Eddie. Remember him? Our neutral stimulus? Do you think he could become a conditioned stimulus? Well, yes. Imagine you kept seeing him at the bus stop and you started talking to each other, and he turns out to be a funny guy, telling you some funny stories and jokes, and you can't stop laughing. The laughing and seeing him turns Eddie into a conditioned stimulus. Spending time with him becomes pleasurable. Sound familiar? So reinforcers play an important role. Some examples of some primary and secondary reinforcers are tangibles, such as toys, stickers. Then there are edibles like snacks or sips of juice. There are sensory reinforcers, such as tickles and light-up toys, activities like board games or movies, and socials, such as verbal praise like good job. We use these reinforcers to deliver them contingent on the desired behavior that we're trying to improve. For example, if you want to improve your learner's attending skills, when they face you, place their hands down and make eye contact. You may reward them with one of the reinforcers I have mentioned above, like a sticker or a sip of juice. By using the reinforcer, you will likely increase the behavior over time. If the behavior increases and occurs independently, then the process of reinforcement has occurred. Now, using reinforcers is essential in the teaching process. However, if you always use reinforcers, then your learner may never do things independently when a reinforcer is removed. Or even worse, they may actually lose skills because you stopped reinforcing them. Remember extinction? So how do you deal with this? You want to be able to fade your reinforcers over time. We don't want our learners or clients to be dependent on reinforcers. We want them to be able to work without always expecting something in return. Initially, new behaviors need to be reinforced right away and all the time until they become strong behaviors. This would be known as a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Each time the behavior occurs, we need to reinforce it. Once a client no longer needs assistance with that behavior and is able to do it on their own, we can start to fade the reinforcers. The behavior would then be placed on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. That is, the behavior will be reinforced every now and then. We'll discuss intermittent schedules of reinforcement in a few moments. But I'd like to talk more about continuous schedules of reinforcement and the effectiveness of a reinforcer. Let's stop for a moment and do a Marvel character. We're talking a lot about so many important things, and I want you to pace yourself and take breaks where needed. The Marvel character is Groot, spelled Groot. Okay, let's continue. What makes a reinforcer effective? Reinforcers must be contingent on a behavior. Motivating operations can alter the value of the reinforcer. Individual differences play a major role, and magnitude or the amount of the reinforcer delivered can also impact the effectiveness. I'm going to explain each one and how it impacts the behavior. If you ask the child to sit on the floor and they complied, and you gave them a high five about 2 minutes later, do you think they'll listen to you the next time? Probably not. Well, that may not improve the behavior or maintain the behavior over time. In order for a reinforcer to be effective, you need to immediately give the reinforcer. Research has shown that you have a few seconds to deliver that reinforcer, but the more immediate it is, the better it is. Think of it like this. I want you to clap your hands when I say so, okay? Are you ready? Clap your hands. Great, that was easy, right? Now let's do it again. Clap your hands. Good. So how did that feel? How did the second time feel? You were probably wondering if I fell asleep or something, right? It probably didn't feel so great. You want to think about reinforcing a behavior at a 0-second delay, which means no delay at all. So when you say clap your hands, the client claps, you reinforce quickly. Another reason why it's important to reinforce immediately is because you don't want to accidentally reinforce another behavior. Imagine the child that you're working with claps their hands when you ask them to, and you're leaning behind to get a toy to reinforce them. And as you're giving the toy, the child is now picking their nose. You may not think that this is a big deal because it's nose picking. But what if that nose pick turned into a headbutt, scream, or the client is engaging in a serious self-injurious behavior? This is where it becomes very serious and behaviors are accidentally reinforced. This is something we definitely want to avoid and ensure that we don't give the reinforcer when a behavior like this is occurring. The reinforcer needs to be contingent on the target behavior, which means it must follow that desired behavior. If you want the child to learn to follow your instructions, such as clean up, a reinforcer must follow that behavior. The behavior needs to be in contact with the reinforcer at some point in order for it to improve. This is a common mistake in practice. Sometimes therapists will tell me that a behavior is not improving, and I ask them, what are the reinforcers being used? And they'll look at each other and say, well, we weren't using one here. You need a reinforcer. You need reinforcers that the child likes. Therefore, you'll need to conduct a preference assessment. I'll talk about this in our preference assessment class. But what I want you to really think about here is you need to reinforce the desired behavior right away and contingent on the behavior. Suppose you are teaching your learner to write the letter A. You need to reinforce that behavior once they have completed it, right away. What if the learner does the right desired behavior but then engages in self-stimulatory behaviors right after? Suppose they finished the letter A, put their pen down, and then they started engaging in hand flapping. What do you do? If you give the reinforcer contingent in that moment, you've now reinforced the hand flapping behavior and not the letter A. This is a problem. It's important that you understand the impact of reinforcing a behavior in that moment. If the learner or client does something else, you may delay the reinforcer. Have them do something correct and desirable, then reinforce something good, something correct, but not something undesirable. Everyone has different likes. Some like sushi, some don't. Some people like cinnamon, some don't. If someone gave me a cinnamon bun as a gift for doing something for them, I would probably run the other way and never do anything for them again. Okay, a bit dramatic, but I'm trying to highlight a point here. Individual differences are important when selecting reinforcers for a client. Don't assume all kids like bubbles or Play-Doh. I had a little guy that enjoyed painting, and one day we decided to do hand painting. Many of our kids we work with love having paint on their hands. But when we went to put paint on his hands, oh boy, it was not the case for him. We got one stroke of paint on his hands and he pulled away and it was him bursting into tears. Paint on his hands is not a reinforcer, and if we tried using that during a teaching trial, we would definitely not see improvements in that skill and maybe even begin to see escape-motivated behaviors. Establishing operations. An environmental change or event that results in deprivation, which changes the value of a reinforcer. For example, you just had a big lunch, hamburgers and fries. You're stuffed. Now imagine I offered you a slice of pizza. You'll most likely push it away because of the value of food has now decreased because you're so full. However, imagine you just went for a long run and you're so thirsty. You go into your kitchen and you see a cold bottle of water. You chug that water down so fast. The value of water here is very high because you've been deprived of it during your run. It now becomes more valuable. Relating this to your clients, if you used a reinforcer that your client has had freely or has had access to it all day, trying to use it contingent on a behavior may not be effective. Suppose a child you're working with has access to the iPad anytime they want it at home. Working for it at school may not be effective because they've had access to it freely and all the time. Why do work and do something effortful to gain access to something that you can have freely later in the day, right? Now imagine you won the lottery and you were getting a paycheck every week for a large amount of money. Would you go to work? I'll leave that for you to answer. Another factor that would make a reinforcer more effective is the magnitude or amount. The amount of time your client engages in an activity or toy. For example, getting 30 seconds of a movie versus 2 minutes. The number of times the reinforcer is given per unit of time. For example, getting a piece of pretzel 15 times per minute versus 3 times per minute. The intensity of the reinforcer. For example, a hug with deep pressure versus a gentle, lightly squeezed hug. Think of a time when someone gave you a hug. If you've ever gotten that deep pressured, intense hug, that hug may have been more memorable to you than that light, gentle hug that you once got. If the client you're working with is required to clean the entire kitchen and the reinforcer is 5 minutes of TV watching, the amount of work compared to the amount of the reinforcer may not be equal, and therefore the client may not be motivated to complete the task because of the amount of that reinforcer. The reinforcer amount should be equal to the effort put into the behavior required. The more effort required in the task, the greater the amount the reinforcer should be. For new behaviors, the magnitude of the reinforcer should be greater than the amount given to previously acquired behaviors. If you're teaching your learner to walk, for example, you need to give a reinforcer every time, every step, until the behavior improves. New behaviors need more reinforcement, while older ones, mastered skills, don't need big reinforcers or a great amount of it. All right, let's do a secret word before we get into the quiz. The word is cinnamon, my least favorite reinforcer, or maybe I should call it a punisher. We have just talked about a lot of stuff, so let's jump into the quiz, stretch a bit, and good luck. Positive reinforcement is the addition of a desirable stimulus that increases the future occurrence of a behavior. True or false? The correct response is A, true. Giving a client any item following a behavior is known as a reinforcer. True or false? The correct response is B, false. The learner you work with loves stickers. After completing a math problem at every lesson, you give them a sticker. After several weeks, you notice that the learner has shown improvements in his math problem solving skills. This would be an example of the process of positive reinforcement. True or false? And the correct response is A, true. A tangible reinforcer is something like which of the following examples? A. Sip of juice. B. Board game. C. High five. D. Spin top. And the correct response is D. Spin top. An edible reinforcer is something like which of the following examples? A. Sip of juice. B. Board game. C. High five. D. Spin top. And the correct response is A. Sip of juice. A social reinforcer is something like which of the following examples? A. Sip of juice. B. Board game. C. High five. Or D. Spin top. And the correct response is C. High five. In order for a reinforcer to be effective, it must be delivered immediately. How long should the delay be? A. 2-second delay. B. 0-second delay. C. No longer than 5 seconds of a delay. D. There should always be a delay. And the response is B. 0-second delay. This would be the best response for this question. In order for a reinforcer to be effective, you must consider A. The type of reinforcer. B. The amount of the reinforcer given. C. The value of the reinforcer in that moment. D. All of the above. Or E. None of the above. And the correct response is D. All of the above. A behavior that is reinforced every single time is on what schedule of reinforcement? A. Immediate schedule of reinforcement. B. Intermittent schedule of reinforcement. C. Continuous schedule of reinforcement. D. Continuum of reinforcement. Or E. None of the above. And the correct response is C. Continuous schedule of reinforcement. Remember, new behaviors need to be reinforced every time in order for them to become strong behaviors and in the client's repertoire. This is known as continuous schedule of reinforcement, CRF. Reinforcers need to be immediate, contingent, valuable to the individual, and the amount of the reinforcer needs to be worth it. Earlier, I briefly mentioned intermittent schedules of reinforcement. This is when a behavior is reinforced every now and then. It's used to maintain behaviors. For example, a teacher does not praise a child every single time they return to the teaching table when asked. In the beginning, when they were learning the skill, sure, the teacher said, "Great job listening. I like how you came back to the table." Maybe they even got a sticker or a piece of pretzel. But now that they have the skill, the teacher no longer praises them every single time. She may say it once in a while. There are 4 types of intermittent schedules of reinforcement: fixed ratios, fixed intervals, variable ratio, and variable intervals. Fixed ratio is when a reinforcer is delivered after a specific number of responses. Imagine you worked on an assembly line. Fixed ratio would be that you have to complete 200 pieces before you can take a coffee break. Another example is you give your learner a cookie after completing 3 math questions, or you give your dog a treat after he does 2 tricks, and so on. The amount required is fixed, that is, a given number of responses or actions must be done before you can access a reinforcer. Fixed intervals is when a reinforcer is delivered after a specific amount of time that has passed. For example, a child gets a piece of cookie after sitting for 2 minutes during circle time, or giving a student a sticker after doing homework for 10 minutes. To compare fixed ratio and fixed interval, both are specific in the number or amount, but the difference is one is based on the responses given, while the other is based on time. Variable ratios are one of the best schedules of reinforcement. Imagine you were playing on a slot machine, like the ones you see in this picture. You put a coin in and pull the handle, not a match. You put in another coin, pull the handle, nothing. You do it again and again and again, then finally you get $10. Now you're feeling lucky, so you put in another coin, and again and again. Every so often you keep winning, and so you keep continuing to play the game. Well, your behavior is maintained because you just never know when you'll hit the jackpot. The idea here is the reinforcer is delivered on an average number of responses, so you never know when you'll get the reinforcer. It keeps you engaging in the behavior so that at some point you'll get access to that item or thing. You can see how gambling or game playing can become so addictive. In practice, your client, learner, or child that is on a VR schedule will work hard because they're anticipating the reinforcer and they never know when they'll get it. We use VR schedules a lot at the center, especially during table teaching. It allows us to keep the learner at the table for longer periods of time since we gradually increase the schedule. Since VR schedules is an average number of responses, if the VR schedule is 5, it means you can do anywhere from 1 to 10 responses before delivering the reinforcer. Remember, the average is 5. Going back to the slot machine example, you may play 2 times then win, play 10 times then win, play once then win. With the child working at the table example, the child may do 1 math question, then get a piece of pretzel, then do 3 math questions, then get a piece of pretzel, then 1 math question and get a piece of pretzel, and so on. Again, as the learner tolerates the work at the table at a VR 5, you can increase it to a VR 6, which means you can do 1 to 12 responses. VR 7, which is an average of 7, which means you can do 1 to 14. Lastly, variable interval schedules are an average of time that passes before getting the reinforcer. A child may answer only 2 math questions during a 6-minute interval. With a VI 6, you can reinforce anywhere between 1 minute and 12 minutes. Imagine your learner is doing math questions. You reinforce them for doing the work at 2 minutes, then at 6 minutes, then at 9 minutes, then 4 minutes, and so on. Remember, the importance of intermittent schedules of reinforcement is to maintain behaviors over time. If you reinforce a behavior every single time, then stop reinforcing it, you've actually placed the behavior on what we call extinction. If you recall back to our ABA class, extinction is when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced. So intermittent schedules of reinforcement help fade the use of reinforcers. So here is a table to help you remember the difference between the 4 types of schedules of intermittent schedules of reinforcement. You can use this when you study for your final exam. During the competency assessment, we'll put you to the test, so don't worry. Okay, everyone, it's time for the quiz. Good luck. The behavior is reinforced every single time. Which schedule of reinforcement is it? A. Continuous schedule of reinforcement. B. Fixed ratio. C. Fixed interval. D. Variable ratio. E. Variable interval. And the correct response is A. Continuous schedule of reinforcement. The behavior is reinforced every 6th response. Which schedule of reinforcement is it? A. Continuous schedule of reinforcement. B. Fixed ratio. C, fixed interval, D, variable ratio, or E, variable interval? And the correct response is B, fixed ratio. The behavior is reinforced on an average of 3 minutes. Which schedule of reinforcement is it? A, continuous schedule of reinforcement, B, fixed ratio, C, fixed interval, D, variable ratio, or E, variable interval? And the correct response is E, variable interval. Well done. The behavior is reinforced on an average of 2 responses. Which schedule of reinforcement is it? A, continuous schedule of reinforcement, B, fixed ratio, C, fixed interval, D, variable ratio, or E, variable interval? And the correct response is D, variable ratio. The behavior is reinforced at 4 minutes. Which schedule of reinforcement is it? A, continuous schedule of reinforcement, B, fixed ratio, C, fixed interval, D, variable ratio, or E, variable interval? And the correct response is C, fixed interval. The behavior is reinforced on an average of 2 responses. Which one is correct? A, FR1, B, FI4, C, VR2, or D, VI1? And the correct response is C, VR2. The key here is to look at that it's an average, which would be variable, and because it's responses, we're looking at a ratio and not time, so it's not the interval. Well done. The behavior is reinforced on a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Which is correct? A, FR1, B, FI4, C, VR2, or D, VI1? And the correct response is FR1. What is positive reinforcement? A, the addition of an aversive stimulus, B, the removal of an aversive stimulus, C, the addition of a desirable stimulus, or D, the removal of a desirable stimulus? And the correct response is C, the addition of a desirable stimulus. Way to go. This is when a stimulus follows the behavior and increases it over time. Is it A, intermittent reinforcement, B, positive reinforcement, C, continuous reinforcement, or D, none of the above? And the correct response is B, positive reinforcement. Okay, great work, everyone. Before I jump into the next part of our topic, let's do a secret word. The word is banana. Okay, we've talked about positive reinforcement, but what happens when someone's behavior continues to exist but isn't like what we described above? Let me explain. Have you ever had those days where the work is piled up and it just won't go away? It could be your laundry or office work, and doing it just feels like a pain. So you find yourself escaping it by doing other things, leaving your home altogether. Ever wonder why? Well, when we look at negative reinforcement, we can understand what maintains these kinds of behaviors. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus that increases the future occurrence of a behavior. The key in the definition here is removal of an aversive stimulus. For example, someone who nags a lot for the person to take out the garbage will increase the likelihood of your behavior to get up and do it so that you can stop that aversive stimulus. Imagine you're studying in your room and the window is open. You hear people laughing and yelling, cars going by. You can't concentrate, so you get up and close the window, therefore removing the noise. Your behavior of getting up and shutting the window increases over time when the loud aversive noise from outside occurs, and therefore you shut the window to remove that noise. Negative reinforcement involves an escape contingency, which is escaping some stimulus. We do this all the time. We escape loud noises, cold temperatures outside by going inside, and so on. These are things that may be causing us pain or discomfort. So by escaping it, we can ultimately turn off the aversion. So we take out the garbage to stop the nagging. Parents, teachers, and therapists may use escape contingencies quite often. A child may be told that they need to finish their math worksheet before they can go and play. So finishing the math worksheet would result in escape from the table. Behaviors that are maintained by negative reinforcement usually have more of an avoidance contingency, which is postponing the aversive stimulus. Going back to the laundry example, you have a pile of laundry that needs to be folded, and you really don't feel like doing it. So you postpone it until later. You say to yourself, I'll do it later, just going to finish my show. We also call this procrastination. We would say that the behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement, and more specifically, an avoidance contingency is present. As I mentioned earlier, a reinforcer is a consequence that is presented following the behavior. We know that reinforcers will increase the likelihood of the behavior. With positive reinforcement, the reinforcers are pleasant stimuli, but with negative reinforcement, the reinforcers are known as negative reinforcers or aversive stimuli. So what is a negative reinforcer? Remember, negative reinforcers will still increase the behavior over time when contingent on that behavior. Suppose you are avoiding doing the pile of work on your desk, and your supervisor walks over and says, "Can you clear your desk, please? Now?" And your supervisor continues to repeat that until you finally get the job done. We all do this. It's what we call nagging. So nagging, noise, a shock are all negative reinforcers, unpleasant, painful stimuli. Just like primary or unconditioned reinforcers we discussed earlier, such as water, warmth, and food, there are negative reinforcers that are unconditioned stimuli as well, known as unconditioned negative reinforcers, such as shock, noise, bright light, or pain. No one taught us that painful electric shock is aversive to us. As humans, we want to avoid pain. A bright light in your eye is something we can't tolerate and will often result in pain. But when we feel pain or loud piercing noises, we immediately react by removing the discomfort. This is an innate response to keep us safe. Conditioned negative reinforcers were once neutral stimuli that have now become aversive. For example, a person talking may not be aversive, but a person nagging is. For instance, imagine you're a parent and you tell your 5-year-old to clean up their room. When they don't listen, you may continuously tell them to clean up. To stop this, the child finally cleans their room. In the future, when the parent begins to say, "Clean your room," the child will most likely get up and clean that room so that they can avoid the aversive nagging. Other examples of conditioned negative reinforcers are seeing dark clouds in the sky, which in the past, seeing dark clouds resulted in a storm. If you're walking or riding your bike, you may get indoors before you become soaking wet. Another example is seeing red taillights lit up on the road while you're driving. You get off the road because in the past, that was an indication of heavy traffic. When you're determining if a behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement, you need to look at the relationship between the events and behavior. For example, if you take your son or daughter to the grocery store and they see chocolate at the checkout, the child begins to cry for chocolate, you immediately give the child chocolate so you can quiet them down. Whose behavior is maintained by positive reinforcement and whose behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement? Let's break this down. The child sees chocolate, the child cries, then the child gets chocolate. This behavior is maintained by positive reinforcement. Why? Because the pleasant stimulus, chocolate, is delivered contingent on the behavior. However, the parent hears the child crying, the parent gives the chocolate, the child stops crying. This behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement. The cry is aversive to the parent, and therefore by giving the child what they want, they remove the aversive stimulus for themselves. So in this example, you can see the use of both positive and negative reinforcement. In practice, positive reinforcement is used to teach new behaviors and maintain them over time, while negative reinforcement can be used to treat feeding problems, improving student learning, and other problem behaviors. Food refusal in young children is a primary example of children escaping food, and therefore their behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement. The parent puts a spoonful of food in front of the child and the child pushes the spoon away. The behavior of pushing the spoon works in that it removes the food. The child reads a page and the teacher says, "Great work." Which one is correct? A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement? And the correct response is A, positive reinforcement. Well done. The child pushes the spoon of cereal and the food is put away. The behavior is maintained by A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement. And the correct response is B, negative reinforcement. You get in the car and begin driving. The seatbelt indicator begins beeping over and over until you put your seatbelt on. The behavior is maintained by A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement. And the correct response is B, negative reinforcement. You clean your workstation every Friday when your supervisor is on site because someone will get a prize for the best workstation. The behavior is maintained by A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement. And the correct response is A, positive reinforcement. You're baking cookies and put on oven mitts. The behavior is maintained by A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement. And the correct response is B, negative reinforcement. You're teaching your learner at the table. They begin looking away and you remove all teaching material because you believe they are bored. The behavior is maintained by A, positive reinforcement, or B, negative reinforcement? And the correct response is B, negative reinforcement. My final thoughts. Reinforcement is a vital principle of ABA and one that is used everywhere by almost everyone. We use it in our everyday world in practice, and it plays a major role in how we learn and behave. Reinforcement increases behavior over time, but we have to pay close attention to the actual items that we give our learners or clients. Not everything is a reinforcer. People make the mistake often. We have to assess reinforcers effectively to ensure that what we're delivering will impact the behavior. If your learner is not showing improvements, you need to question those reinforcers. You need to question whether or not they truly are effective. Maybe the item is good enough, but the magnitude isn't enough. So always remember to question the reinforcers and the effectiveness of the reinforcer to be successful with your clients. In one of our classes, we'll discuss preference assessments and how to find those potential reinforcers. Until the next time, happy studying. All right, everyone, here is our competency assessment component. I'm really excited for this one because this is our right or wrong challenge. And this is all about me giving you some scenarios. I want you to think about each scenario as we go through it. I'm not going to give you the answers this time. This time it's going to be on the quiz. So I'm going to read the scenarios to you. Think about it. You're going to watch a video and you're going to see whether it's right or wrong, and then you can put that on the quiz at the end. Okay, are you ready? Let's get started. Here's our first scenario. Kate's daughter has been refusing food, and the BCBA on the team has advised Kate to be playful during eating sessions. The BCBA recommended using playful ways contingent on the eating behavior. Is Kate using reinforcement correctly in the situation? So let's watch the video. Okay, so again, I'm not going to tell you whether it was right or wrong. I want you to really think about it. Pause the video, go back to it, rewatch it if you felt like you weren't sure. All right, let's move on to the next scenario. The BCBA has recommended to the classroom teacher to reinforce Jenny on a fixed interval of 5. Did the classroom teacher use reinforcement correctly here? Let's watch the video. Okay, here's scenario number 3. Johnny works at a circuit board company, and he needs to complete 7 circuit boards before taking a break. Has Johnny used reinforcement correctly here? Let's take a look. All right, here's scenario number 4. Billy is required to stay at the lunch table on a variable interval schedule of 15 seconds before the RBT allows him to gain access to his toy. Did the RBT use reinforcement correctly here?